Addressing environmental health concerns in urban slums is a particular focus of his work. His 20-year career has included work with the United Nations, bilateral donors, and NGOs in Asia, Africa, and the former Soviet Union on health and environmental policy research and development. Please welcome Anthony Kolb.
There you go. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to have to change my presentation a little bit too, partly because I think the wrong person is sort of here. John Barrazo sends his regrets. John is a long-time friend of many of the folks that you've been hearing presenting today, has had a relationship with Rotary and a number of the organizations here. He is the team leader of the environmental health team at USAID. And unfortunately, because of some family health problems, he wasn't able to come. So he tapped my shoulder fairly late, and together we threw together a presentation. But I've been changing it in my head for the last day, and hopefully it'll come out straight, though, as I try to present it now. There's also, one of the reasons I was sort of excited to come, because there's some strange connections and parallels with coming to a Rotary event like this. The last time I spoke at a Rotary event was when Jimmy Carter was president. You saw his visage up on the screen today. I was at a Rotary luncheon thanking some Rotarians who had just given me a scholarship as I was going off to university, and describing to them why I was planning to study engineering and try to work in developing countries, because I'd recently been to the Dominican Republic, and some things came together in my head from that experience that drove me to sort of pursue this career. So I once again thank Rotary for helping me get started on that path, and it's interesting to see my own personal journey sort of meet up with Rotary again here, and I think there's some interesting co-development that's going on. I actually work with John Barrazo and partially funded by his environmental health team, but I also sit in a separate bureau within USAID, which is involved with economic growth, agriculture, and trade, and also education. I don't know how many of you have a sort of fuzzy idea about the U.S. Agency for International Development. Are you all fairly comfortably familiar with this? Quasi? Yeah, that's what my cousins accuse me of when I go back home to try to explain what I do to them. They say, well, you just work for the CIA. USAID began in the 1960s. It, like many of the organizations like World Vision, the US government became involved in international development assistance really in a big way following World War II in the reconstruction of Europe. There were a number of different projects and agencies that were set up. These were consolidated during the Kennedy administration into USAID. Today it is the main mechanism where your tax dollars go to assist in development projects internationally. It has a loose relationship with the Department of State. The State Department is responsible for our diplomatic relationship with the world. Department of Defense has a security interest in the rest of the world. And AID has been always involved sort of in the same places, but working along the development lines. Recently, under the current Bush administration, there's been an attempt to ensure that USAID's efforts go very much along the lines of our diplomatic efforts. And so state and USAID have been somewhat merged in a way. But the reality is that international development assistance from the US government has always been somewhat politically motivated and politically channeled. That's why ever since we became involved in trying to assist in the peace process in the Middle East, most of our development assistance has gone to the countries in that area. And not where the poorest people are in the world, but again, for other interests that the US government has around the world. But let me give you a little bit of history. Oops. You told me that would work. little bit of a recent history of USAID's work in the water supply and sanitation and hygiene area. Just go one previous. It's not scrolling. Can you do it here? How about here? Okay. Going back. Yeah. Sorry. Going the wrong way. There you go. Okay. Sorry. These are not stellar slides. Sorry. No, that's it. The theme that I want to get to eventually and very quickly is collaboration. And I think for effective collaboration to happen, you first have to have a meeting of the minds. You have to have mutual goals and objectives that you can agree on. And I think that meeting of the minds, certainly with Rotary, is right there. I was very impressed with Ron's presentation this morning. And I think a lot of the thinking behind it is right along the lines of the development of the thinking in this sector at USAID. And that's reflected here in this history. Back in the early 80s, there was still a strong emphasis on pumps and pipes in much of the programming that USAID was involved in. But within the sector in the mid-80s, there were a number of very damning studies done looking back at the investments in the sector by a lot of development agencies. And understanding that building in sustainability, making sure that you are addressing the needs as expressed by the populations that you are working with really is very important. And there were sort of too many engineers sort of telling people what you need and giving it to them, and it wasn't working out all that well. So there was an evolution of more attention being paid to the institutions involved in terms of the partnerships on the ground, training for those partners, and becoming more comprehensive in implementation of programs which not only provide improved access, but also pay attention to the very important educational aspects of hygiene promotion. Later in the 90s, there was even increasing emphasis in USAID program on health outcomes. Some would criticize USAID as becoming too health-focused in what we do. It's a very large part of the portfolio now, and paying less attention to, say, some economic growth, agriculture activities. But also the enabling environment, the policies and the institutions that are important to sustain and also scale up the activities that we are supporting. Presently, in the last few years, there's been really a diverse set of activities that would be sort of put under the WASH realm. We have a fairly large project called the Hygiene Improvement Project, which John Barrazo manages, which has brought together a lot of this sort of stream of thinking. There are a number of integrated programs, creative integrating programs at some of our missions. We call the offices in each country that implements programs we call mission. They have a lot of discretion in terms of the design of the assistance that they provide. And many of them have been innovating in terms of integrating a variety of their different objectives into programs that mutually support one another. There's been some creative partnerships that have developed over time between some private sector actors as well. Much focus on utility reform and the finance necessary to extend infrastructure. And then recently, an act that was passed in Congress and then some follow-up interest by your elected representatives under the Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act. And this is an act and some associated appropriations recently that is pointing us in the direction of paying more attention to water supply and sanitation. And for those of us that work in this sector, we're very happy to have the support. Unfortunately, they haven't at the same time increased the overall budget. So we're sort of borrowing from Peter to give water to Paul. But we're working at it. is not a simple sector. There are a lot of different programs, and USAID covers the gamut, similar to sort of the description of what World Vision does. I mean, we're involved in every aspect of development. But you know, you might say, well, what does democracy and governance have to do with water supply? The largest supplier of water in most countries are the public utilities that serve from small towns to large cities. And the reason that they don't supply water to poor people in those situations is really a political issue, a governance issue. And where governments are more responsive to their citizens, you start to overcome some of those barriers. And that's part of the democracy promotion work that USAID supports. We do submit a report every year to Congress. We've been doing this for a number of years now that tries to summarize from all these desperate programs how we're contributing to the sector. And this just gives you some rough ideas. These acronyms here are for the regions of the world where USAID is active. You can see that for Africa, there's quite a bit of attention being paid there. But what some people have been critical of, much of this assistance, about 75% of it, is as part of our humanitarian assistance, not development assistance, not long-term sustainable interventions. That is much more longer tradition in places like Asia and the Near East. Here you see the total number. This is the water supply and sanitation going up to about 300 million a year, where we include some of the large wastewater treatment projects. In fact, for the sorts of things that you'd probably be interested in, the numbers were more only around 100 and 125 million. Congress has asked us basically to double that this year, and it's going to be a challenge to try to do that. But still, it is very much a drop in the bucket, and in terms of a major initiative, this is small compared to the much lauded programs like the HIV/AIDS presidential initiative and even the malaria initiative. These are still small investments. And that's where you all can help by talking to the people that decide these things, which they sit in this big white building down the street from our offices. Some quick examples of the types of activities. Do I need to go into this? I think it's important for you all to understand, again, as you maybe interact with USAID, that there are different technical professions, I guess, and units that are represented. And each of these technical focuses have a different attitude towards the sector. So there wouldn't be many that would be I guess, attuned or even familiar with or very much of a champion of point-of-use technologies, for example. There's a large section of people that focus on infrastructure, and for them, you know, if you can't serve 1 million people with lots of pipes and a long-term solution to the problem, they're not all that interested. We've been trying to, those of us that see a need for both things are trying to sort of go that middle path and make sure that we're investing in all these important areas. And that's where it's important to have strong partners that can help us demonstrate the value of these interventions. That's where the cross-cutting partnerships come into play. I think I'm going to skip quickly through these next slides. This, again, is just one frame of reference. This is a sort of model of how you look at hygiene improvement that I think UNICEF and WHO both support. And again, it's a complicated area, and you really need to invest in all these different aspects. John has a number of slides here on point of use that I won't go into because it's been covered very well by others already. Many of the products that you've already seen that USAID supports. But I need to give one little plug for my area. And this is not pretty to look at, but it's one of my favorite pictures in John Barrazzo's photographs that he's taken over the years in the field. This is a public toilet in Ahmedabad, India. And well, I'll get past that quickly because it is not nice to look at. But it's just to remind you not to forget about sanitation as well. It's an often neglected area of intervention. It's hard to deal with the big infrastructure investments. It oftentimes does take community-level interventions and tailored solutions. But it's incredibly important for the urban poor. Sanitation in rural areas, coverage is lower, but it's not as important, really, to protect human health, to deal with sanitation issues there. It's incredibly important in urban areas where people living in very close proximity. It's very difficult oftentimes to find a location for a facility. And so it becomes a very critical area of fecal contact for human beings. In the urban realm, I just want to make a plug for, I think, the importance of Rotarians' actions. I think that, as I mentioned before, many of the challenges associated with serving the urban poor are really political and institutional, in a way that if you can convince municipal leaders and the people that run utilities to overcome some of the problems of serving people where they're not supposed to be living, in overcoming the problems that they have with the regulations associated with giving somebody a tap because, well, you're living on land that belongs actually to the railroad company, and how can I connect you as a customer? These sorts of things can be overcome with the right pressures. Poor people oftentimes don't have the ability to hit those pressure points. Rotarians in the countries where you partner are those influential people that do have political connections and do have voices that people listen to. And I think through your relationships with them and you showing your concern about the issues in their country, I think helping to mobilize them to hit some of those political soft points, it could be a very valuable role that Rotary could play. Again, I think it is important to be concerned about contributing money towards sort of really hardware sort of things. But the software aspects of the enabling environment are just as important. And I think, again, everyone has their unique ability to affect those enabling environments. USAID as representing a large government and having long-term relationships with governments, we do have the ability to affect policy at a national level. But it's difficult sometimes for us to affect it at a local level. And again, I think the nature of Rotary and how it works, I mean, that is your forte. You are involved with politics and community action at a local level, and you know how that works. And I think you, working with your partners and colleagues internationally, I think that's something you really have an ability to share with them. And it's very important because it is part of this democratic development that is really the key to overcoming developmental problems. So I just wanted to give a plug for that. The last slide that I want to just quickly go through is just to suggest some possibilities for collaboration with this big agency that mainly does a fairly boring thing. It gives out money to people. But how you tap that money and sort of get into this game is not always easy. I was happy to hear some of the examples that Tony gave about some collaboration and being able to use USAID money. The reality is it's not so important to talk to myself and John in Washington. There's a certain value in that. But much of the decision making about how USAID's resources are used is made at the country level. So that's the first stop in terms of finding maybe common implementing partners that you'd like to put money towards. Again, I think this sort of model of where USAID puts some money into a project and you do as well. There's a great encouragement now in the agency to look for opportunities like this, to leverage our resources. So if you do have good partners, if you do have a little bit of money and a good idea, it is possible if you can find the right person to talk to. And unfortunately, in all the countries where we work, there may not be a lot of sensitivity to this particular area of work. I think we can do some complementary things. Again, where we are working with the Ministry of Health and have a long relationship with them in terms of determining their policies on health, we may have a lever in helping to get the Ministry of Health to approve a biosand filter as being an accepted point-of-use treatment system. This sort of collaboration, I think, is possible. And then sort of the big and recent idea of forming alliances and sort of long-term alliances is what's called the Global Development Alliance effort. And this is where we work with organizations like Rotary or private institutions, and basically through signing of a memorandum of understanding, find some creative way to work together long-term. And it oftentimes goes beyond individual projects to being a relationship where we develop projects over time. And that can go on, again, at the country level, but we also have that ability to develop these alliances at the national level through headquarters. So I'm out of time, and I won't go into some of the other collaborative initiatives that USAID is involved with, including WOWI, which is just a great acronym. You got to have good acronyms. But again, it's a diverse sector. Our resources are largely field-driven. Remember, talk to those offices. They're usually located now in the embassies in the countries where USAID is working. It's a small amount of money, but it's growing, especially if you can keep writing those letters to the Hill. And we are very interested in collaboration, and we need to have it to really have any scalable impact. Thank you very much.